Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with how Trump has undermined reactionary centrism in the Democratic opposition, which has moderates claiming to oppose extremists on both the left and the right, but more often attacking than left. Now the left and the center of the Democratic Party appear aligned, as does much of the country, who want politicians who will stand up to bullies like Trump and government thugs who shoot down Americans in the streets. Joining us is Jake Grumbach, Associate Professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a contributing editor at Boston Review. He's the author of Laboratories Against Democracy, How National Parties Transformed State Politics, and he has an essay and forum at Boston Review. We will discuss how not to defeat authoritarianism. Moderation used to help Democrats win, but its advantages now have been greatly exaggerated. Then, with Trump's armada off Iran used as leverage for on and off again and on again talks with Iran on Friday in Oman, we'll speak with John Hoffman, a policy analyst in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute and a professor at George Mason University specializing in Middle East geopolitics and political Islam. His work has been featured in Middle East Policy, Open Democracy, The Cipher Brief, and Foreign Policy magazine, and he has an article at the American Conservative. We will discuss Iran without a plan. The administration risks repeating the Iraq debacle as farce. Then finally, we'll speak with Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and former vice president at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. A political analyst and frequent writer on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy, he served as director of the U.S. Office of B'Tselem and co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. He is the co-author with Mark Lamont Hill of Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, and we will discuss his article at Mondo Weiss, The U.S. Occupation of Gaza is Officially Beginning. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now, Jake Grumbach, who is Associate Professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a contributing editor at the Boston Review. He's the author of Laboratories Against Democracy, How National Parties Transform State Politics, and he has an essay and forum at Boston Review, How Not to Defeat Authoritarianism. Moderation used to help Democrats win, but its advantages now have been greatly exaggerated. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jake Grumbach.
Great to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And actually, the Democrats now are united in this latest vote that they took, although there was obviously some games played where 21 Democrats voted against the bill and 21 Republicans voted as well against it. So that was how, obviously, a backroom deal was made on that one. But the Democrats, both the Progressive Caucus and the centrist Democrats, are pretty united, particularly about what happened after the killings of American citizens by the government in Minneapolis. So is Trump basically making moderate Democrats, centrist Democrats, somewhat irrelevant? Has he pushed them to the left?
That's a great point, Ian. So in recent weeks, especially not as much after the killing of Renee Good, but more so after the killing of Alex Preddy in Minneapolis by ICE and Customs and Border Patrol agents, the centrist Democrats have aligned with the sort of progressive flank of the Democratic Party to take a stronger stand against funding the Department of Homeland Security, which funds ICE and CBP. But the key thing here is that we've seen over time, the more moderate wing has been behind. So in the US House, for example, a number of moderate Democrats voted in favor of unconditional increased DHS funding after the killing of Renee Good, but before Alex Preddy, and then have sort of come back to apologize. So the question we should be asking is sort of why did it take so long when many would say an internal occupation of an American city by militarized federal agents is not going to go well regardless.
So, do you think this has to do with standing up to a bully? In other words, do voters in this country, are they more emotional than intellectual in the sense that if you go back, for example, when John Kerry was running against George W. Bush, his strongest asset was that Bush was a draft dodger and Kerry was a decorated veteran from Vietnam. But Karl Rove, Bush's political operative, took that away with the Swiftboat attacks. And Kerry did not stand up to, he just sort of brushed them off. And he came across as a wimp, even though he wasn't a wimp. So is the wimp factor at play here? In other words, if you don't stand up to a bully like Trump, you're a wimp. And we need people to stand up to this guy at this moment.
So this is a great insight that gets at part of the argument that I and my co-author Adam Bonica write in this recent Boston Review piece about sort of the Democratic Party in an age of authoritarianism, is that the traditional way politics works in elections is that voters are, we hope, they vote based on policy agendas and ideology. And they vote to reward politicians who make the economy grow and punish the politicians who make you worse off over the 4 years they're in office. But what more recently we've seen is, that was always partially true, but voters in large part voted based on group-based identities, emotion, and also just vibes. Like you like a particular candidate and you kind of identify with them and think they're cool. All of those go into why people vote. But more recently, politics has fundamentally changed in the US for a number of reasons. One is the rise of social media and technological change in media and the decline of local newspapers through to the rise of the internet, the decline of more local political coverage. So all politics is not local anymore, it's national and based on national flashpoints. And then also, people have become extremely low trust and anti-establishment. So Trump really won in 2016 to, drain the swamp of the consensus of both parties' elites, and as well as capitalized on anti-immigration sentiment and so forth. So really politics is different. And right now, one thing, the old style was to say, okay, there's a lot of moderate voters out there. We can do better in elections if we position ourselves as bipartisan, reasonable centrists, But when coming up against a, authoritarian who's using, the Trump administration is using its institutional authority to punish political enemies, to tilt the playing field in favor of its own coalition and party against competing political coalitions, and has gone around the Constitution and around checks and balances to do initiatives like DOGE and ignoring judicial orders and due process in the Constitution around immigration enforcement. That's a new territory where you can't actually keep just saying, okay, well, I'm going to agree with half of that and expect voters to reward that. Trump himself has really shown that if you can cut through this social media era, you can gain big dividends electorally. So the Democrats are learning that a bit too little and a bit too late.
Well, the Texas left-wing populist Highwater used to refer to the only centrists, the yellow lines in the middle of the highway and dead armadillos. I'm not doing justice to his quote. But you cite in your article how some of these centrists on the Democratic side have really sort of tanked, like Jared Golden, who represented Maine's 2nd Congressional District. He opposed Nancy Pelosi for House Speaker. His favorability has collapsed, and he chose not to run again. And likewise, Kirsten Sinema, who in many ways, along with Joe Manchin, frustrated Biden's ability to get a lot of stuff done, voting essentially with the Republicans to stymie his more progressive moves. So those are pretty strong examples, aren't they, of a shift in American politics?
So this is key. So when you listen to most punditry right now and many political consultants, and sort of donor-backed think tanks in the Democratic Party are really pushing that the silver bullet right now is to just go more moderate. But our argument is not that, moderation is always bad, that you should always take the farthest left position on every issue, nor that going left is always going to be good either. It really depends on the situation. And we're seeing a lot of variation where the moderate Senator Ruben Gallego from Arizona has taken a much stronger anti-authoritarian and anti-ICE line in his response compared to, as you mentioned, Jared Golden, who won in a Trump-leaning district, but now is retiring. Very early, as well as, recent statements and votes from Marie Gluesenkamp Perez in Washington State, another moderate member of the House. Basically, you don't have to be a progressive to, stand up to authoritarianism. So it really depends. The point, though, is it's not a silver bullet to just say, go moderate, nor to just say always go left, even though in many cases going left, for example, on economic policy is popular right now. But we see, what you should know is that the American public did want a more restrictive border policy than we saw under Biden's early years. Biden actually did get much more harsh on the border in 2023, but it was a little too late. But then Trump comes in and proposes not only to, shut down asylum eligibility for new immigrants, but he says he's going to do a mass deportation force of an internal federal sort of militarized secret police that essentially would violate due process, go into people's homes, has murdered American citizens now, is imprisoning children and breaking up families, is violating due process across the board. The Democrats of all stripes should have realized, okay, maybe the public wanted a bit more of a restrictive asylum policy or slower trickle of immigration, but they don't want essentially American fascism, and it's important to get out ahead of that rather than wait till the polls are so overwhelming that the Democratic politicians feel safe enough to speak out. Instead, the Democrats should lead where polling is going, not wait till far after the mass public realigns on some issue and then take a stance. That's not leading, that's poll watching. And that is kind of the name of the game for this Democratic leadership under Chuck Schumer and much of the Democratic Party's consultant and donor class.
Well, in yesterday's program, I was talking with Emma Winger, an immigration lawyer, and I said, what's going on with these warehouses they're buying, and they're warehousing something like 73,000 people that have been rounded up, and these big Core Civic and Geo Group are making tons of money out of the taxpayers, and they warehouse these people and charge every day, their food and lodging, etc., and they mark it up, and it seems like a racket. And she said, no, there's something worse going on here. What they're doing is they're essentially engaged in a form of torture, which the taxpayers are subsidizing. They are making life so miserable for these people that they've rounded up that they will waive their legal rights and accept deportation. And that is the Miller-Trump strategy. So it's so much worse than it's being reported, right. Jake.
Not only that's probably right. I'm not an exact expert on within ICE detention facilities, but it's potentially correct. But what we can clearly observe as well is when there are judicial orders that say do not deport this legitimate legal immigrant, as well as the Bill of Rights against, illegal search and seizures and demanding papers, please. ICE has also detained a tremendous numbers of U.S. citizens for their exercising their free speech and freedom of movement rights to, for example, monitor and film ICE in Minnesota. Really, this is what we can see when we take a step back is that current sort of immigration militarized force right now under the Trump administration does not appear to be based in the purpose of finding criminal undocumented immigrants and deporting them, but rather as a move to consolidate the regime's authority. And that is, I think, all of this goes together where the goal is to consolidate power rather than these sort of actual policy positions on things like immigration. And that's why when, Democratic leaders, including Chris Van Hollen, the senator from Maryland, if you remember months ago, the sort of Democratic pundits were saying, don't talk about immigration, don't emphasize that issue, just talk about kitchen table issues and Trump inflation and so forth. Chris Van Hollen went to El Salvador to visit Kilmar Abrego, who had been against judicial orders deported to essentially a torture chamber prison in El Salvador under an authoritarian regime in El Salvador. He goes and advocates for this individual's rights and was rewarded for that. Chris Van Hollen became more popular due to that leadership, and the Democrats gained a lot in public opinion on the issue of immigration. We've seen repeatedly that leadership pays off rather than sort of waiting after the fact, hoping for, the time to be right and the public to already love where you're going. That just makes you look like an unprincipled flip-flopper who's just has their finger up to the wind rather than somebody who wants to run for office and have state power in order to build a better world.
Right, and Van Hollen is toying with running for the presidency, and as is another popular Democratic Senator, Chris Murphy, who's also becoming much more outspoken. But when you write in your Boston Review piece, Jake Grumbach, how not to defeat authoritarianism, that, to be fair, polarization doesn't correctly diagnose a bind that Democrats face. They are geographically concentrated in ways that create structural disadvantages in the Senate and Electoral College. In order to win a governing majority, they need to do well among relatively conservative districts and can't afford to alienate most voters outside of deep blue urban areas. Does that still hold? Because what just happened in Texas with the election of a Democrat by huge margins, which has really freaked out the Republicans, he didn't get any more Democratic votes. He got a lot of votes from disaffected Republicans and independents. So is the lesson there that the Democrats have got to appeal to Republicans and independents? Because there's many reasons why the Democrat running against Trump for president, Kamala Harris, in the last election, why she lost was because she spent too much time courting Liz Cheney, and there weren't that many disaffected Republicans to put her over the top. Is the fact that what we're learning from this recent race in Texas telling us the opposite? So where's the strategy now?
Ian, I think you hit the nail on the head, because the point is it depends. And the key thing here is Kamala Harris in 2024 did try to run this moderate kitchen tables-based campaign. Brought along Lynn Cheney, as you mentioned, a former, Republican, had tried to court, really focus on just the economy, did not take sort of left stances on the Israel-Gaza war, nor on really any social issues. At the same time, she did have some pretty progressive positions back in 2020 that around things like trans rights that some argue were too far left for voters. But the bigger issue is actually that she was not seen as a credible leader on behalf of those policy positions. So even though the Democratic Party's economic platform is more popular than Republicans' economic platform when you ask voters about it, sometimes voters still don't find the Democrats to be credible leaders. So I think it depends. It's less about your specific policy positions and more about whether you are credible on them, whether voters believe you can lead on these issues when you're in office. For example, the Democrats were punished in 2024 for inflation, But Trump's policy platform of tariffs and, other economic high-end tax cuts and tariffs were of course going to inflate prices even worse. And that's what's happened. And yet voters still trusted Trump on inflation as an issue. How can that possibly happen? That's because for whatever reason, Trump commanded this respect and credibility as being against the status quo, against the establishment. Kamala Harris wasn't able to achieve that despite having a more popular policy agenda. And in Texas, you're seeing volatile voting as well. So the point here is that, many of the pundits in 2024 said, this is permanent, a permanent realignment that young men and Latinos have shifted towards Trump. Democrats have to get much more conservative. But it turns out those were blips, and now young men and Latinos have turned against Trump in a dramatic fashion. And the point here is that you have to take the opportunities where they come. There's no silver bullet, perfect messaging strategy or perfect ideological position. The argument Bonica and I make in this piece is the Democratic Party should let 1,000 flowers bloom, should stop spam text fundraising, and should become an anti-corruption party that really walks the walk and distinguishes itself from the sort of Epstein list style politics of elites, especially within the Republican Party. Recruit candidates who are young, legitimate representatives of their, home areas and towns, particularly more working class candidates, younger candidates, not just geriatric candidates who are good at fundraising from wealthy donors, but regular people. And all of those is going to create a diversity of policy positions and ideologies depending on the area. I am not here to say that, you can never go too far left or that voters are not a constraint. Like voters will punish you if you take policy positions that are far outside of what they would like. That said, you do have a lot of leeway as a candidate if you're an authentic representative of your community that inspires people and comes off as somebody who is credible and actually, cares about this. This is again how we're seeing Ruben Gallego, a very moderate Democrat, appearing to seize the moment more effectively than Jared Golden or Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez right now.
Right. But he's basically a macho liberal. And I think that's always been the ticket because the Democrats, when you look back at Mondale and Dukakis, they all, again, I'm talking about the wimp factor. The macho liberal Democrats are the ones that get elected, like Jack Kennedy and Ruben Gallego, former Marine, etc. So in many ways, at least that's my diagnosis. I don't know.
No, there's something to that. Aesthetics and style do matter, and unfortunately, we actually do find candidates of color statistically perform just as well as white candidates. It's important to note, and for the most part, the same is true across gender. Women perform just as well as men in congressional elections, but at the presidential level, it's much more uncertain. And increasingly, politics is just really dominated by the presidential nominee because of social media and national political attention, and because of Trump. Voters are really focused on who the presidential nominee is, and there may be something to the fact that it does appear that sexism probably plays a role in how these politicians perform electorally. That said, we don't see any of that sort of gender bias or racial bias for candidate identity in Congress or governor's offices.
Well, I thank you for joining us. And just in closing, I do have an answer when you were talking about how come Trump, who's destroying the economy with his ridiculous tariffs, how does he get away with it? It's because the goddamn press still keeps talking about, he just slapped tariffs on China. He didn't slap tariffs on China. He slapped taxes on the American people. So the failure is on the framing of the press and the fact that the Democrats can't keep reminding the American people about the reality of this insanity that Trump keeps pursuing.
Ian, let me just double down on this. The Democratic Party, so the average age of a senator is about 65 years old, and the average age of a member of Congress is about 58. And these really older Democrats are being caught flat-footed on how to cut through the media ecosystem, and social media is part of it. You need more energy. So, Zoran Mamdani is much more skilled at this, as you see, with the use of Instagram and things. But then in addition, we have to be clear that the Trump administration's authoritarian moves, he has actually pressured media companies and wealthy individuals to bend the knee this time. And that is part of why you see the Washington Post doing what it is, and so much media, CBS, really bowing to the regime's wishes and becoming closer to state-run media, because the Trump administration is pressuring them, saying, nice company you got there. It would be a shame if we sicked the FCC on you if you were not to support us. That is authoritarianism, and we need to call that out as well. That said, there are huge unforced errors by the Democratic Party when it comes to media and just journalism in general that you've mentioned.
Well, I thank you for joining us, Jake.
Thanks, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jake Grumbach, who's an associate professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a contributing editor at Boston Review. He's the author of Laboratories Against Democracy, How National Parties Transform State Politics, and he has an essay and forum at Boston Review, How Not to Defeat Authoritarianism. Moderation used to help Democrats win, but its advantages now have been greatly exaggerated. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking at how Trump's armada off Iran is being used as leverage for the on and off again and on again talks with Iran on Friday in Oman.
Well, I met you on election night as we cried over our beer. Nothing you could do would cheer me up. Broke up later that year. Well, how come you and I aren't winners? Yeah.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now are John Hoffman, a policy analyst in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute and a professor at George Mason University, specializing in Middle East geopolitics and political Islam. His work has been featured in Middle East Policy, Open Democracy, The Cipher Brief, and Foreign Policy Magazine. And he has an article at the American Conservative, Iran Without a Plan. The administration risks repeating the Iraq debacle as farce. Welcome to Background Briefing, John Hoffman.
Thank you for having me on, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I don't know how farcical it is, but there's been some wrangling over the venue for these talks that are supposed to take place between the United States and Iran, under pressure from President Trump, who's moved in what he calls an armada with the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier battle group and a lot of planes and other assets sent in as leverage to get Iran to talk. Initially, the talks were supposed to be on Friday in Istanbul with a lot of Middle East observers in attendance. The issues were going to be both the nuclear issue and also other issues like Iran's missile program and its human rights abuses. The Iranians apparently then said, no, we don't want to talk about anything but the nuclear thing, and we want to do the talks in Amman. And then the U.S. said, no, we're not going to agree to that. But then just, an hour or so ago, they've said they're back on. So where does it stand?
Oh, it's difficult to keep up these days. But what I would say is, first and foremost, the fight over the venue is a broader struggle over what's really going to be discussed, because Iran wanted this to be discussed in Oman, signaling that it only wants to discuss the nuclear issue and views this as a continuation of previous negotiations with the United States. The United States wanted it to be in Istanbul and wanted to discuss a whole host of issues like you just mentioned. But it does seem that currently the talks are on schedule to take place on Friday. The problem is regardless of where they take place, regardless of what day and so on and so forth, it's the substance that matters. And There are certain issues such as the ballistic missiles program, Iran's support for proxies across the region, its own domestic human rights atrocities, and so on and so forth, that are clear red lines for the regime. So even if these negotiations take place, they could go nowhere very quickly.
So they will be in Oman. Is that the latest?
Yes, they will be in Oman on Friday, and this is after several Arab countries urgently lobbied the United States not to walk away from negotiations. And it seems that at the current moment, the United States is going to proceed with negotiations, but if this proceeds like it did last year, leading up to the 12-day war, where the United States asks for, no domestic enrichment, and now they're asking for Iran to surrender their stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, cap their ballistic missiles program, curtail support for proxy, so on and so forth, then again, this could just end up going nowhere very quickly, and we could find ourselves right back in the situation that we were earlier today when talks had ostensibly collapsed.
But if the talks take place, will they be like they were last time, which is pretty dysfunctional, where the Iranians are in one room, the Americans are in another room, and the Omanis shuffle back and forth?
Yeah, but that is quite likely how things are going to be, and it's unfortunate because this has gotten wrapped up in such a broader issue of the United States repeating a lot of the failures of its own U.S. Middle East policy. And if viewed in isolation, this discrete nuclear issue is a deal here is actually very possible. But it's when we start bringing in so many other things that Iran has very clearly stated are red lines, and there's a lot of hawkish individuals in the United States and Israel who are pushing the United States to adopt these maximalist demands. This is where things start to get iffy.
Well, but Trump's already claimed that he destroyed their nuclear program, right? But the Israelis have been weighing in. There have been endless meetings between Israeli generals and American generals, both here and in Israel. And a lot of pressure is obviously coming from Netanyahu and the IDF. They're itching to strike and finish the job, aren't they? They want to go after Iran's missile program.
Yes, the Israelis want to go after the missile program. Netanyahu, in particular, wants regime change. He's been very open about this since first assuming office as the premier in 1996. But like you said, in terms of justifying the strikes on the nuclear program, a lot of us in DC were saying, well, hold on a second. Trump, you said the nuclear program was, quote, totally obliterated. So what are we doing back here? And of course, those claims were quickly contradicted by U.S. intelligence and the IAEA. But what this is really shows is the Israelis, in particular, but also hawks in Washington, will keep moving the goalposts. First, it was the nuclear program, then it went to the ballistic missiles, then it went to protecting Iranian protesters, and now we're back to talking about ballistic missiles and support for proxies and so on. That's because for a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. and Israel, they already have a predetermined course of action, which is regime change. And they're kind of frantically reaching for justifications to justify this predetermined course of action.
But I think Trump's got blood on his hands, along with the Shah's son. They both urged the Iranian people to demonstrate against this brutal and murderous regime, and they got slaughtered. And we don't even know the numbers. They say around 6,000. Some other estimates say it's as high as 20,000. I mean, this regime is more ruthless than Stalin. I mean, Stalin killed a lot of people, but he sent most of them to the gulags, where they worked them to death. But these people are absolutely brutal, and they are unapologetic. And now this regime is rounding up the dissidents, and God knows what will happen to them. So do you think, or do you share my kind of disgust at both Trump and the Shah's son for urging these brave Iranian citizens to stand up to this disgusting government and then leaving them out to dry?
I think this is a classic example of Donald Trump. Donald Trump creating problems and then claiming to solve them, and often backing himself into these corners that are of his own doing. Like you mentioned, the crackdown on the Iranian protesters was incredibly brutal. Iran is a very vicious dictatorship involved in a host of malign activities across the Middle East. It should go without saying that Iranians, like all people on planet Earth, deserve to live free, determine their own future, and so on. But the problem from the United States perspective, from a perspective of U.S. interests, is despite the breadth of the protests, elite cohesion held, and the security apparatus remained loyal to the regime. And this is what allowed them to really crush the protests. And there's no evidence that U.S. military action will rekindle the protest movement or empower it to the point of regime collapse. The Iranian opposition remains deeply divided. Hawkish U.S. policies have historically empowered regime hardliners. And for a lot of us, and even a lot in the Iranian diaspora who aren't of the Reza Pahlavi ilk, are stressing that there is really no sure way to undermine domestic opposition to the regime in Iran or in Tehran than by trying to appropriate their struggle to justify foreign military intervention.
So I don't think Trump really wants to pull the trigger on the military. I think he's using it as a negotiating tactic. And I think his main focus is getting a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it sounds farcical. I know that's in your title of your article, Iran Without a Plan, the administration risks repeating the Iraq debacle as farce. Well, we have a pretty farcical regime with a guy that wants to build monuments to himself all over Washington, like, all these tin pot dictators around the world do. And he's obsessed with getting a Nobel Prize. So I think there's a real possibility, isn't there, that Trump will agree to any kind of deal with them in order to get his prize, and it won't necessarily have to be a particularly good deal.
Well, I mean, look, Trump seems to be laser focused, obsessed on this Nobel Peace Prize. At this point, just give it to the man so he stops doing so many crazy things. But what I think, what you said is pretty spot on about him being averse to using military force, because what does Trump like? Trump likes these quick, flashy, what he views as low cost victories. Think about like Venezuela, think about Midnight Hammer, the operation in Iran during last June. He likes these one and done, very quick in and out things. But this is fundamentally different because striking Iran at the current moment, there's a very high likelihood that the regime will view the combination of domestic protests, which were incredibly large, and external military action as an existential threat to the regime. And at the very least, it's very possible that Iran will want to signal to Israel and the United States that they cannot bomb Iranian territory at will, kind of this adopting the mowing the lawn approach that Israel has in places like Gaza. So the stakes are a lot higher this time around, and Iran has signaled that it will retaliate in kind. And that is what concerns a lot of us, particularly given the fact that there are 40,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East scattered across at least 63 known U.S. military bases and other facilities in the region.
Well, what the Israelis are saying, and my understanding, they were putting pressure on Trump to continue after he sent the B-2s in and on those two sites. They wanted to finish the job, or as you use their expression, mow the lawn. They wanted to stop mowing the lawn. They wanted to finally, whatever metaphor you want, they wanted to finish the job, right? So if there is a military action this time, it wouldn't be limited, right? I mean, I don't know it would necessarily involve boots on the ground, but it would involve an awful lot of bombing and lobbing of missiles back and forth.
Yeah, and I think you're correct too in terms of Israel doesn't necessarily want to mow the lawn; it wants to just absolutely torch the lawn. But what concerns me is a couple weeks ago when it looked like strikes were imminent, a lot of regional actors, pressed Trump on holding off because there wasn't adequate U.S. resources in the region. Israel was actually one of those actors at that moment. But it wasn't, from Israel's perspective, wasn't just so the United States could surge more military assets into the region uh, to defend Israel and other countries, but it was the fact that Israel very likely has been pretty widely reported at this point, saw the strike plans, realized that Trump's strikes were more symbolic than anything towards regime change, and wanted to pump the brakes because they wanted time to try and push Trump in that direction. So this is the inherent risk here, is because those who are pushing Trump to take military action in Iran, whether it be Israel or whether it be hawks in Washington, they will not want this to be a one-off operation, and they will continue pressuring Trump if Trump does decide to strike. They will continue pressuring him to, one, go all the way, and two, manage some sort of internal transition once the regime does collapse. And for the United States, I think you would immediately find yourself involved in a situation that is Iraq on steroids.
So you don't think there's a way to get rid of this regime? Is that the bottom line here?
I completely believe that the regime in Iran is horrible, and that the people deserve to live free. But I think it comes with a great deal of hubris here in Washington to think that the United States can successfully engineer and sustain a new status quo inside Iran through military force. I think this really just epitomizes a lot of the flawed thinking that has underpinned U.S. Middle East policy. Any real meaningful reform within Iran has to be domestic led, it has to be self-sustaining, and it cannot be externally imposed.
Well, as I said earlier, though, John, Trump has given them the worst of all worlds because he encouraged them to rise up and warned the government that if they murdered their own people, he would not stand for it and he would do something. And when they murdered their own people, he did nothing. And the same applies to the baby Shah. He encouraged them to do it and when rise up, and then they got slaughtered. So he has blood on his hands. And if you look at what Trump just did in Venezuela, it's pretty obvious that he doesn't give a damn about democracy and freedom. He's put the same bunch of crooks in. He's kept them in place and just got rid of the top guy. So he'd be happy to have the same thing happen there. Is it possible that you could make some kind of deal with Iran and keep the IRGC in place? And is there any chance that the clerics could be removed? Or, I mean, it's a theocracy. I can't imagine that happening. So I guess my question is, John, if we don't have the military option, which you rightly suggested would end up being like another Iraq, the negotiation on the nuclear deal option, is it possible that it will end up like the Venezuela deal, where you'll basically keep the same people in place and pretend that you have a victory and you have struck a blow for democracy?
Don't see a necessary copy and paste in terms of leader decapitation, arresting Maduro. I don't see that necessarily taking place with Ayatollah Khamenei. But I think one of the points that you just noted here, you mentioned the prospects of an IRGC dictatorship. And this is, again, what a lot of folks, even folks who are bullish on the use of military force within Iran at the current moment, have pointed out, is that you're very likely going to be faced with a scenario in which the IRGC takes control. And, color me skeptical, I don't think Donald Trump has the best interests of the Iranian people in mind. I don't think Donald Trump has the best interests of a lot of people in mind. But the idea, to me at least, that Trump would be taking military action on behalf of the Iranian people just kind of strains credulity to the breaking point, especially when U.S. Middle East policy has, for 8 decades, I know I've been on this show talking about it a lot, but for 8 decades has been rooted in the prevention of democratic rule in the Middle East. So I could very well see a scenario in which Trump throws the Iranian people under the bus because Trump is Donald Trump. From a perspective of U.S. interest, if we want to approach the nuclear issue as its own isolated issue, I do think there is a deal to be made here. And I do very well think that you could see a scenario in which if we reached a deal, Donald Trump will spin it as the, greatest deal ever made or whatever. But No, by Trump telling Iranians to take to the street, by hyping up the rhetoric, by sending all of these military assets into the region. This is again a problem that Donald Trump is confronting because of Donald Trump.
Well, John, I thank you for joining us. And of course, the other side of this is that there's a good deal of skepticism about Iran using the nuclear issue all along as a distraction, something that they're perfectly willing to give up on, so that they don't have to give up on other issues. Do you believe that to be the case?
Not necessarily. The nuclear issue has played a really central role in Iran's relationship with the United States, but also Iranian domestic politics, particularly the struggle between the more reformist camp and the more hardliner camp.
And again, I've been speaking with John Hoffman, who's a policy analyst in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute and a professor at George Mason University, specializing in Middle East geopolitics and political Islam. His work has been featured in the Middle East Policy, Open Democracy, the Cipher Brief, and Foreign Policy magazine. And he has an article at the American Conservative, Iran Without a Plan. The administration risks repeating the Iraq debacle as farce. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into how the U.S. occupation of Gaza is officially beginning.
We expected something better than before. We expected something more. Walk away now, and you're gonna start a war. Whatever went away, I'll get it over now. I'll get my...
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and a former vice president at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, a political analyst and frequent writer on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. He served as director of the U.S. Office of B'Tselem and co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. And he's the co-author with Mark Lamont Hill of Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics. And he has an article at Mondo Weiss, The U.S. Occupation of Gaza is Officially Beginning. Welcome to Background Briefing, Mitchell Plitnick.
Good to be here, Ian.
So does this mean then the U.S. occupation of Gaza will mean that we'll end up with, once the rubble has been cleared, and that's going to take 5 years apparently, there's just nothing but rubble in Gaza, that we'll end up with high-rises along the beachfront attracting foreign tourists and luxury condos, etc., thanks to the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And then you'll just have, these enclaves of Palestinians living in shanties and tents and whatever they can cobble together ad infinitum. I mean, where's the plan to rehabilitate all of those people that are homeless, and many of them are wounded? I mean, only a trickle is being allowed in now that the Rafah opening is opened for medical treatment. So it doesn't look to me like the future is anything but bleak for the Palestinians of Gaza, who've already suffered a lot.
Yeah, the future is very bleak, and the vision that Trump and Jared Kushner have for these high rises and these beachfront hotels and basically this playground for the rich. I don't see how that dream ever comes into fruition. I don't even think they're going to get started on it right now. They can't even find anyone to provide security in Gaza, this international stabilization force that they want to put together. They can't find anyone willing to do it because the countries that would be willing to be a peacekeeping force are not willing to be the actors who would try to forcibly disarm the Palestinian, not just Hamas, but other Palestinian armed groups that operate in Gaza. Those groups, for the most part, including Hamas, don't have much in the way of heavy weaponry. But right now, Israel is continuing to fund rogue Palestinian bandits, essentially, that are that are threatening not only Hamas and other militants on Israel's behalf, but also the Palestinian population. So Hamas can't give up their handguns and basically the things that they have, which again isn't much, because they would be shot dead by these Israeli backed gangs. So they can't even get there. So if they can't get there, they can't get to even the point where they can start clearing away the rubble that will take years. So none of this is actually getting off the ground, but it doesn't alter the fact that what the United States is trying to do and has gotten the imprimatur, unfortunately, of the Security Council and too many other states in the region. This Board of Peace has assumed a certain power, basically just grabbed a certain sense of authority over Gaza, delegated it to what they call an executive board. But again, none of that can move forward. Because they can't even get themselves into Gaza. They can't get the board of Palestinian technocrats that they've put together. They can't even get them to begin to work because none of the infrastructure for them to do any work is there. So all of this is kind of half-baked, but it will mean that there will be some sort of American presence in Gaza for many years to come. And that presence will very likely be a target for Palestinian protest and probably from attacks from armed groups. So none of this is going to work out the way Trump seems to want it to, and it's all going to come back and really be the worst for the Palestinians who've already suffered so much, and their suffering seems to have no end in sight.
But the Board of Peace, which Trump has put together, and he wanted Putin on the Board of Peace. The idea you want Putin on a board that's about peace is in itself a disgusting insult. But he's not been able to attract anybody except a bunch of his kleptocratic buddies like Orban in Hungary and
exactly. And he's gotten Netanyahu apparently to agree to be on it as well. So, but the Board of Peace itself is not really so much about Gaza. It's intended to challenge the United Nations. That's what Trump wants to do, and if that's what he really wants it for, it's not a bad thing in his eyes that it doesn't include too many other powerful figures. He wants total control of this entity that will become some sort of international, if not ruling body, but influential body, and he wants to be the absolute dictator of it. That's the way the Board of Peace is set up.
Right. He controls the purse strings, right? The money's in his pocket.
He controls everything. He controls the decision-making process. He has veto power over everything. Unilateral veto power. He's in there for life, so it's not connected to his role as president of the United States, and he has the sole power to determine his successor. He has the sole power to approve new members and to kick out existing members. So I mean, it is complete, literally complete autocracy.
Well, it's also kleptocracy, isn't it? I mean, how much?
It is. Those two usually go together.
Right. Well, the money's in his pocket, so that's how he rolls.
Exactly.
He's monetizing his presidency, and he's monetized U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
So
and created a vehicle for that to continue when he's not president anymore.
Right, but now that you've made a very clear case that it's not working, their plan's not working. The Jared Kushner, Witkoff, Trump plan is not working. Then let's look at the Palestinian side of it. Mm-hmm. What's their fate?
Well, their fate, unfortunately, is consistently outside of their own control. That has been the agenda of the United States and Israel. It is the agenda of this Board of Peace executive board that's supposed to be controlling Gaza. There's no Palestinians on that board. The only Palestinians involved are on this technocratic board that's just a bunch of bureaucrats and administrators. That's really all it is. They are reduced to just sort of figures that are out there. And in Kushner's vision, if you look at what he presented at Davos, there are sort of there's this tourist area on the coast, an industrial park on the eastern side of Gaza where the Israeli border is, and in the middle are various industrial parks and housing residential areas, and those residential areas will house Palestinians who are deemed acceptable to this new regime. This is again in his vision, that are deemed acceptable to the new regime and would be basically the servants in the industrial park, in the tourist hotels, and in various spaces like that. Obviously that would not be sufficient to cover all the Palestinians that are remaining in Gaza, and there is still, I think, an intention to dramatically reduce the number of Palestinians that are in Gaza.
Well, one of the more disturbing things is in The Guardian today. There's an article called "Revealed: Israel Bulldozed Part of Gaza War Cemetery Containing Allied Graves." And apparently this war cemetery was one of the few green spots in Gaza that was well maintained, and it's got the graves of British, mostly Australian soldiers, Canadians, Indians, all kinds of Commonwealth soldiers. But they bulldoze a whole section containing the graves of 100, mostly Australians, killed in World War II fighting the Nazis and the Vichy French. I mean, what's going on with these crazy right-wingers running Israel? Don't they have any respect for the soldiers who fought against the Nazis?
No, and I don't find that, I guess, as appalling as I find it, I don't find it particularly surprising. This is the place, this is where nationalism gets you to. The Israeli sensibility at this point is hostile to even its own allies. It's hostile to any foreigners. So when I think, now we don't know this, the Israeli army claims that they bulldozed this as part of an operation because Hamas fighters were hiding in the cemetery, which is of course nonsense. You flush them out somehow and you avoid bulldozing the cemetery. That's what any decent army does, or even not decent. That's what most armies would do. But there is such hostility, I think, to any sort of foreign presence, and I think that's what this was a sort of expression of. That's just a guess, of course, on my part. We don't know the full circumstances. I'm not buying the Israeli story, and we don't really have an alternative at hand. But that's what this looks like to me. And again, not surprising, this ultra nationalism that exists now in Israel that has, that is magnified. Israel was always a nationalistic country, but it has become so magnified. And it's not just Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich. It's Netanyahu, it's the Likud, it's most of the Israeli right, much of the Israeli center right has also bought into this, and even some of what they call the center left has bought into at least parts of this ultra nationalist narrative. We recently just saw the former defense minister, Boji Ya'alon, come out and absolutely destroy the current Israeli government, basically comparing them to Nazis and comparing it to that ideology. And this was a man from the Likud. This was a right-wing and is still a right-wing figure. And yet even he sees that. And I think that's what he's looking at. He's looking at this sort of boiling over of ultra-nationalism that has gotten some people think Israel was always this way. It wasn't. It has gotten a lot worse in the past 10 or 15 years.
Well, Mr. Plitnick, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Mitchell Plitnick, who's the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and a former vice president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, a political analyst and frequent writer on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. He served as the director of the U.S. Office of B'Tselem and co-director of Jewish Voice for Peace. And he's the co-author with Mark Lamont Hill of Expect for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, and has an article at Mondo Weiss, The U.S. Occupation of Gaza is Officially Beginning. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.